In today's tutorial, we're painting some loose fall florals using simple and easy watercolor techniques. We'll paint some roses, flowers in different perspectives, and some leaves and filler florals to complete the composition, all while using this beautiful autumn color palette to help bring in the season. So let's get started. All of the supplies I'm using in this video are linked below in the description box. So here's a quick look at what our final composition will look like. We have a few primary florals, which we're going to paint first, and then we'll add a couple layers of leaves, some filler flowers here, and then we'll finish with some more details and foliage. And one more quick note before we start, this is a fall themed tutorial simply because of the colors I'm choosing. But you can easily make it a spring or summer composition by using brighter, more summery colors too. So I have trimmed down my paper into an 8x10 sheet. Feel free to use any size you'd like. If you are using a smaller sheet like a 5x7 or a 6x8, you'll just need to make your flowers a little bit smaller. But if you're using generally the same size as I am, 8x10, 9x12, then you can keep your flowers nice and big. I'm going to start with my Quin Sienna, and I am using my Neptune brushes, which are my favorite for loose florals because they have super thirsty bristles. I have started by grabbing a good amount of pigment onto my brush, and I'm going to lay down some little marks just like this, almost like little scratchy marks. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush so I just have clean water. And then I'm going to pull out some of that color, push down, and create my first petal. So I'm pulling out that color that I initially put down with clean water and then dragging it out to create these flower petals. And that creates this really beautiful loose effect. So when you put down those initial marks, you want to make sure that there's plenty of water and plenty of pigment so that when you have your clean water in your bristles and you start pulling it out, there's plenty of pigment to pull from in those initial marks. If those first little strokes you put down are too dry, when you go back in with your clean water to pull it out, there's not going to be enough pigment to pull from. So you want to make sure those first strokes are nice and wet and full of pigment. And if they dry while you're going, you can always re-wet it. But each time I create these petals, I'm using just clean water in my brush so that when I pull them out, the majority of the petal is nice and light and translucent like that. But I still have that deep dark pigment at the very center. So I like having a good contrast there where we have very dark pigment near the center of the flower, and then it gets lighter and lighter as we pull out the outer petals. Now for the bottom petal, instead of just continuing to add my petals like this, I want it to be a little bit more of a side perspective. So I want this petal here looking like it's flatter, and it's going to be kind of an almond shape here at the bottom. So again, I'm going to start with a pretty pigmented value of my Quin Sienna, but instead of doing my little scratchy marks, I'm going to just push down and create a little almond shape just like that. And once again, I'll rinse off my brush. And you can see my brush is laying sideways now. So instead of pulling out that pigment to create a long petal, I'm just pushing it down sideways, kind of wiggling it, and then you get this beautiful front petal that just kind of gives your flower a little bit of a different perspective. Now, as I said, I really like the sharp contrast between dark pigment and then lighter outer petals. So I'm going back into my palette, loading up some really dark Quin Sienna, and just using the very tip of my brush to tap back in some of that pigment that we lost when we pulled it out into the petals. So just gently tapping that back in, creating some texture marks here in the center. And there is our first flower. So that's looking good so far. If you want to add more to it, you can. I'm going to go back in once it's dry at the end to add a little bit more detail to the center. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is. And we'll move on to our rose here. So the rose is going to be slightly below this one and then to the right. One thing I want you to keep in mind when you paint compositions like this is that you always want your piece to have a sense of movement to it. So you never want to place a flower directly next to another one or right below it, or, you just want to avoid your composition looking a little too symmetrical or too perfect. So I like to always start at a top corner of my painting and then add those primary elements kind of going in a flowy S curve. So we have one flower here. I'm going to put one a little below and to the right. And then we'll add two more down here at the bottom. But just keep that in mind if you're painting compositions on your own. You always want to have that sense of movement in your painting. So our next flower is going to be a rose. I have tons of rose tutorials on my channel, so I will link one up at the top here if roses are challenging for you. And for this piece, I'm going to be using Perylene Maroon, a bit of Permanent Red, and then a touch of my Quin Sienna to get kind of a soft maroon color for this one. And I'm going to start by using the very tip of my brush to create some wispy little C curves. So see that tiny little mark? That is a C curve because it's in the shape of a letter C. So I'm going to add a few more here for the very center of my rose. I'm just kind of pushing down my brush and creating these wispy curves. I brought you in a bit closer so you can see these strokes better, but you always want to leave a little bit of white space when you do your rose petals like this. We don't want the center of the rose turning into a blob of color, so that white space is really important. And once you have those first C strokes down, you're going to rinse off your brush and push down a little harder to feather out those strokes and create that gradient of color. So my brush right now is mostly water, but I do have a little bit of pigment left over. And I'm just working my way around this rose, adding in these C curves. And see, there's white space in between every stroke I do. That white space is incredibly important to help differentiate your petals and define them a little bit more. But working my way around, you can see I'm doing kind of a mix of wispy strokes in between, some strokes where I'm pushing down my brush a little bit harder, and my strokes are always getting bigger as I work my way towards the outer petals. That's kind of something I always do when I paint roses, is those inner petals are really tight and close together. They're small and dainty, and then as you work your way towards the outer rose petals, they get thicker and thicker. Now I'm going to go back in while these are still wet and take advantage of the wet on wet technique. So I loaded up some more pigmented red into my brush, and I'm going to tap back in some of that color. And you can see because those petals are still wet, that color bleeds out gently into the rest of that wet petal. So I'm just adding in some color back in. I'm not doing too much because I do really like the light, romantic look of these petals, but I do want to have a little bit more contrast. So I'm doing this pretty sparingly, but just adding in a little more contrast at the base of these petals. Things are looking good so far. As I mentioned, we will go back in and deepen some of the details and the contrast on these florals once we get towards the end. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is and work on my third primary flower. So again, I don't want it to be directly underneath that first one. I don't want it to be directly underneath the second one, but I'm starting it kind of right in between and a little bit further down. Now this one's going to be another rose, but it's going to be a little bit more of a opened up, expressive type of rose with some skirting petals. So the middle will be pretty similar to this one we just did, but then we're going to add some more petals falling around the outside. So let's start with the center. We're going to do C strokes again, and I did move back to my Quin Sienna color, and I'm going to add these little C curves for the very center petals of this rose using just the tip of my brush. I want to keep these strokes very light and dainty. So I just push and curve down to create that C curve. And once I have the center petals down, I rinse off my brush and start feathering out some of those petals. So I really push down and curve my brush so that those initial petals that I put down kind of bleed out and create these really gentle gradients. So you can see when I paint strokes like this, I'm keeping my hand really light, I'm flicking my wrist, and I'm just trying to create really expressive, loose strokes. I'm not planning things out too carefully or really being precise with my brush movement. The loose effect really looks beautiful when you just trust your intuition, you trust your muscle memory from painting, and let your brush kind of dance on the page to create these organic strokes. And just like we did with this one, I'm going to go back in with a darker pigment and just tap in a little bit more color using quick strokes, not adding too much. And now we can go and add the skirting petals. So for skirting petals, it's going to be kind of similar to how we did these petals. So I'm going to have some falling down around the outside of this rose. So I'm going to start by tapping down some dark pigment, rinsing off my brush, and then pulling out that color to create these little petals coming down around the outside of this rose. Let's add a few more. So just kind of tap them down loosely like that, rinse off my brush, and use clean water to pull that down. So just keep in mind when you do things like this, the majority of the dark pigments or the shadowy parts of these petals are going to be closer to the rose. So I'm tapping in more color there, Where these petals connect with the rest of the rose is going to be the darkest, most shadowy part of the petal. And then as you get further away, the outer edges of the petals are going to be much lighter and more translucent. Let's add a few more here, adding in that dark pigment first, rinsing off my brush, and pulling out that color to create these beautiful petals. So you can see I'm kind of going back and forth between adding darker color, pulling it out with clean water, going back in, tapping some more pigment, and that just comes with muscle memory after you have painted for quite a while. So just play around with it, have fun, experiment a bit, and make sure you're taking advantage of the wet on wet effect. So wet on wet is when you add wet paint on top of a layer that's still wet, and that's how you get those gorgeous bleeds and blooms. So I'm going back in and deepening a little bit of contrast here, and like I said, we can always go back in at the end to deepen things even more. And that's looking good for now. And we can move on to our final main flower, which will be down here at the bottom. So you can see now how this composition will be curving from the top left corner, curving around here, and then finishing out on the bottom right corner. And that's going to really help shape this piece and give it movement. Our final flower is going to be back in the maroon color. It's going to be very similar to this first one we did, but flipped upside down. So the almond-shaped front petal is going to be here, and then the rest of the petals coming down will be pointing towards the bottom right side of our paper. Just like we did on that first one, I'm going to start by putting down these scratchy little marks. I'm just pressing my brush down and adding this very pigmented, very watery mixture down onto the paper. Again, the front petal is going to be down here, so for now I'm just doing the bottom petals. Rinsing off my brush completely and using clean water to pull out that pigment. And I'm pushing down here and lifting back up. So the belly of my brush, the main part of the bristles, are expanding out and then coming back up to create these petals. So I'm pushing down, lifting back up, push down, lift back up. Now, if you want your petals to be longer and skinnier, then you just have to adjust the amount of pressure you're putting down. So you can drag it out as far as you want. If you want them to be thinner, you're not going to apply as much pressure. If you want them to be thicker and shorter, then you're just going to apply more pressure and lift back up sooner. So there's a lot of different variations you can make depending on what style of petals you want. I'm just going to do pretty similar to how we did this first flower, but maybe just a few more petals. I can already tell that these last few marks here are starting to dry, so I'm going to re-wet them. I always want to make sure that those initial marks are very wet and very pigmented so that I can pull that color out with my clean bristles. And now it's time to add that final little front petal that's folding over again. So that's the almond shape here. So I kind of just push down my brush, give it a little bit of a wiggle, rinse off all of that pigment, and feather that out using clean water. I'm going to go back in and deepen the contrast in the center again. So taking dark pigment, tapping in some of that color to deepen the contrast. You can also add some more pigment into the petals if you want to make things a little more dramatic. With the wet on wet technique, as long as the petals are still wet, you can still manipulate the paint however you want. And that is our final flower for the primary elements. And now we can start adding our leaves, our greenery. We will be adding more flowers, don't worry, but I want to make sure I can start at least blocking in where I want the leaves and the greenery, and then we can add more fillers as we go. So I'm going to be using the same brush, which is a size 6 round brush, but I'm going to dip it into my green mixture. For green, I'm using kind of a mix of sap green, deep sap green, a little bit of raw umber to make it more toned down and muted. I don't want a super vibrant green for this piece, but I want to start with a really light value for this first layer. So a lighter value just means there's more water in my mixture and it's a lot lighter, so that as we build more layers, we can go darker and darker. You always want to go light to dark when you're painting with watercolors. Once again, I'll start with this first flower, and I just want, I think, one leaf for now coming off of it. So again, I have a very light value. I'm going to push my brush down and just kind of create this very organic leaf shape. So it's kind of coming down in between these two flowers. And as you work on yours, I don't want you to feel like you have to place your leaves in the exact same places that I am. Feel free to express your creativity, make your own creative choices, but in general, I just want to block in this first layer add some big leaves, and then we can add more to it in the next layers. Let's have a few coming off of this top rose. When I paint my leaves, usually I start with a little bit of a wispy, dainty line, and then I just push my brush down, give it a bit of a wiggle, and lift back up. And I also have a full video here on YouTube that is just about how to paint leaves, especially in the loose style, so I'll link that up at the top if you want to practice your leaves a bit more. But you always want to make sure they have good movement to them. I never want it to be super straight or sticking directly out of a flower. You can see this one's a bit curvy, this one has a bit of a wavy edge. And doing things like that will help your leaves look a lot more natural and organic. So I do kind of a mix. These are big, nice, thick leaves, and then sometimes I'll just run the tip of my brush along the page to create wispy little marks like that too. So if you want to experiment with different types, different thickness of your strokes, feel free to do that. This is just the first layer of leaves, so we will be adding darker leaves on top of this. So this is probably the best time to experiment with your leaves because you can always paint on top of it if there's something that you don't end up liking. So I'm going to add a few more coming off of this orange rose. Again, using quick strokes, not overthinking it. And I found that using a bigger brush like this really helps keep me loose while I'm painting florals like this. If I use a really small brush, then I'm more likely to really overthink my strokes and worry too much about like every little detail. When I use big, thirsty bristles like this, I can just kind of push it down, lift back up, and it creates, in general, a pretty loose leaf shape. So just continue adding these leaves. Don't go overboard because we still want room to add more fillers and more greenery and foliage on top of this. But feel free to just add a few in different areas, and you want to keep that same principle in mind of movement. In general, I want my piece to have that S shape to it. But at this stage, I'm just kind of filling in those gaps, adding in a few different leaves for each main flower, and then we can move on to the next part. So I'm going to add just one more here to fill in this gap. And then taking a step back, I just see that this area is pretty empty, so I'm going to add a little bit of a wispy stem here. And I think I also will end up adding some filler flowers there. So that's all I'm going to do for now. And now we do need to let this dry because when you're layering on top, you don't want it to bleed into that initial layer. So let's let things dry and then we can figure out our next move. At this stage, I know it looks a little goofy because there's still a lot more we need to add to it, but I like to whip out the pencil while things are drying and figure out where I want my filler flowers to be. Now with filler flowers, I really like to have curved stems. I like to have them poking out every which way. Let me show you a quick example. This is the painting I did a while ago that I'm basing this current tutorial off of, but you can see here, these are filler flowers. They're just popping out every which way. They add a great movement to the piece and really helps define that shape of the overall composition. As you saw, they're just very curved stems and they're usually coming out of the sides. I don't normally have filler flowers in the middle of the composition. I like to have them popping out every which way. So you can see I'm not sketching in full flowers at this stage. I'm just putting in some lines that are curved to help me figure out where I want these fillers to go. So feel free to add your fillers wherever you want. This is a great opportunity to practice your creative decisions and make some artistic choices of your own. You can't really go wrong with fillers other than maybe adding too many and making it look too busy. So I'm just having a few stems come out of each of the main areas of this piece. Let's start with the fillers on the top left. I'm going to do a mix of our maroon color and then also a couple of the orange ones. But starting with maroon, the way I like to paint filler flowers is pretty simple. So I'm going to twist my paper here. I just make little marks down on the page, kind of like how we did the flower petals for these ones. But I'm just going to paint 3 of these little marks here. They just look like little buds. You can do as many as you want here, but I just place those down, rinse off my brush, and then I create a little tiny flower bud by just pulling out some of that color. So they're basically just like very miniature flower petals. So I pull out that color, create a little petal shape. And that is generally how I paint my little filler flowers. And this is the part where I just go in between painting flowers and painting additional leaves. So right after I paint those, I'm going to go back into a darker value of my deep sap green and raw umber mixture. I'm using the tip of my brush and I'm going to start creating the stem for these fillers. So to create the stem, I'm just using the tip of my brush and connecting each of these little buds to that main stem. So that is our first little filler. Now, there's so much you can do with these fillers. It's really a great opportunity for you to make your own creative decisions here, but generally I like to add some little wispy leaves coming off of each of these fillers. So again, I'm using wispy strokes. I'm using my darker green, which allows me to layer on top of the colors we've already painted so far. And I just kind of flick my wrist and create these little organic shaped leaves. So that's our first little filler, and as I said, I do also want to create another orange one coming off of that. So I'm going to rinse off my brush and do a very similar technique just to the right. So again, here's my little pencil mark. Just helps me keep on track and make sure I'm applying good movement in this piece. I'm going to start by just tapping down some color just like that. I think I'll just do 2 here. So it's just a small little mark, but again, it has a lot of pigment and a lot of water so that when I rinse off my brush, I can use that initial pigment to create my little flower bud. So I'm just pushing down and lifting back up. It's like a little oval or like a little egg shape. And if you want, you can always go back in and darken some areas if you want, using that wet on wet technique. But this is a really fun time to just place elements down where you want and start to build up this piece a bit more. So again, I switch to my green, paint my little dainty stem, connect both of these fillers, and then add in our additional foliage here. So see how that leaf is falling downwards? That sort of movement in my brush strokes is what's going to give this overall piece a very dynamic look. So that barely took any time, but that is our first little group of filler flowers. And the more we add coming every which way out of this floral composition is going to just make the whole piece look a lot more full and lush. The only thing we need to keep in mind as we work through this part is to not overdo it. So make sure every time you add a little stem like that or a little bunch of flowers, you're taking a step back and making sure you're not overdoing it. So I'm going to go back into my maroon mixture here, and let's have a few more coming off on this side. If you want to have more, you absolutely can. I just usually do my fillers in groups of 2 or 3. So I start by placing down that pigment, and then I use clean bristles to pull some of that out into my flower bud shape. And then I take my green mixture again, and when I add these stems, I'm barely applying any pressure down because I want them to be very dainty and fine lined. And then I just connect these stems to the base of each little flower bud. I add my little leaves here. Probably noticed by now, usually every time I add a little leaf, I add a wispy stem coming off of it. But feel free to add your leaves however you want. And I am going to do another full layer just of additional leaves, especially in this middle area, to help build it up a little bit. I don't normally put fillers in the middle area in terms of filler flowers, but I do put a lot of leaves in the middle. Let's add some curving down on the left side as well, tapping down that color, giving a nice puddle of pigment and water, rinsing off my brush, and creating my little dainty flower bud. So at this stage, I just want you to take your time, add in a few more fillers. I'm going to add a few more coming down here, maybe one coming off to the side here, and then we'll go ahead and add our second layer of greenery. But take your time and be creative here. You definitely don't have to put your filler flowers in the same area that I'm putting mine. But you just want to make sure that each time you add one, it's adding to the movement of your overall composition. I'm happy with where my filler flowers are at this point. I feel like the piece has good movement. So now we can start adding our second and final layer of greenery. So We did this first layer in a very light value of green, so now I'm going to deepen my value a bit. This mixture is mostly deep sap green with a touch of raw umber to desaturate it. And we're just going to find some areas to add a little bit more foliage. Some areas will be on top of ones that I've already done, like what I'm adding right here at the top. Some of these leaves will be completely new, like this one. I'm just pulling out a stem, pushing down and creating a little bit more of a rounded leaf. Because as you add stuff like this, you just want to make sure you're keeping things interesting. I don't want all my leaves and all my elements to look the exact same. I want some to be different, maybe a little bit more like a eucalyptus leaf. I want some to be really wispy like this one. I just want to keep things interesting. So every time I add a new leaf or element, I'm switching things up. A lot of the times when I do this, it's adding some more greenery to some of the filler stems like this, just building it out a little bit more and making those look more full. And then when it comes time to add on top of the center area, I just want to make the piece look more full and look like it's almost the top of a bouquet. So I'm just going to layer some greenery on top here, making sure each time I add it, I'm curving my stem, I'm giving my leaves a lot of good movement, and just keeping things nice and loose. So I do a mixture of adding leaves like that, adding some wispy strokes, building up the depth of this piece a bit more. So I have this stem curving to the left, I'm going to have one curving down to the right, keeping things interesting. So this is really just a part of loose floral painting that comes with practice and experience. You start to develop a muscle memory in terms of how you're using your brush to create all of these elements, and also in terms of figuring out where to place elements. So I know sometimes it can feel a little uncomfortable if you're following a tutorial like this one and you don't know exactly where to place things, but you just have to start experimenting. There's not one perfect way to add a leaf or a perfect location to add a filler flower. You just have to go with your gut. Make sure you're always taking a step back and looking at your painting with fresh eyes and figuring out some areas that maybe need a little bit more. So really practice making some of these decisions on your own here. If there are areas of your painting that need a little more foliage, if there are areas that need more movement, or more balance. Maybe the left side of your painting's looking really nice and full with leaves, but the right side's looking a little bit bare, then you can add some more foliage to the right side. So just start making some of these decisions on your own, and your confidence will start to build up, your muscle memory will build up, and before you know it, you'll be painting nice full compositions on your own. So for example, taking a look at mine here, I feel like I have good movement. I feel like the layers are nicely built up, but this area down here is a little bit bare. So I'm going to add a little bit more down here. I'm going to add a wispy stem, curving it. Always curving my stems. I never want a leaf stem to be poking straight out of a flower or straight out of a filler stem. I always want to give my piece and my elements lots of great movement. And I'm going to go ahead and stop right about here for that second layer of greenery. For the last step of this piece, I'm going to add some final details to bring out the contrast a little bit more in my flowers. When I add final details like this, I really like to deepen the contrast. That's usually what my last step is just to really make all of these flowers pop. And I like the darkest part to be the center of the flower. So for both of my maroon flowers, I added a touch of Payne's Gray to my maroon mixture to really deepen it. If you have any dark colors like Payne's Gray, even a dark blue or a shade of black, you can add just a touch of it. And I'm just gonna go back in and deepen the center a little bit more, starting with the rose. So using the tip of my brush, I don't wanna go overboard here because I do really like the loose light effect of this rose, but I just want that center area to be a little bit darker. So I'm using the very tip of my brush. I am not applying a whole lot of pressure here, but just deepening that a little bit. That's all I'm going to do. So it's just a couple little brush strokes, but it helps that center of the rose really pop. I'm going to do the same thing here, using the tip of my brush and that very dark mixture of maroon, and just adding a little bit of a wispy stroke to each of these flower petals to deepen that center. So just adding a little bit of texture using a very dark mixture. We'll do the same thing to the orange as well. So I added a touch of Payne's Gray to my Quin Sienna. Just barely adding a little bit of texture here with that darker mixture. And I'll do the same thing for the center of this rose as well. Just adding the tiniest bit of contrast just in the very center. So I'm only placing this mixture in those areas that are already pretty dark, that already have that shadow effect. That's going to be it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. And I do have an entire playlist here on YouTube with other fall and Halloween themed tutorials. So if you want to keep the autumn vibe going, be sure to check those ones out next. And I'll see you in another tutorial very soon.